I used to believe that love could survive anything, even distance, even silence, even the slow erosion that comes when one person starts living in a completely different world from the other. For years, I held on to that belief like it was a lifeline. Maybe that's why I stayed so long, trying to patch the holes in something that was already sinking. My husband and I have been together for 12 years, married for 7. When we first met, he was the man he is now, not the powerful, unshakable entrepreneur who headlines business conferences and makes deals worth millions. Back then, he was just an ambitious man with big dreams and an even bigger heart. We built everything side by side, the business, the home, the future we dreamed of. We talked about growing old together, traveling the world, building a family rooted in love and laughter. And for a while, it felt like we were truly living that dream. He used to come home with flowers just because. We'd cook dinner together late into the night, laughing over burned pasta and too much wine. We'd make plans on Sunday mornings, little weekend trips, random hobbies we wanted to try, the silly dreams that belonged only to us. It was simple, but it was ours. But something changed after his company exploded in success. At first, I was so proud. I still am in a way. He worked hard for everything he has. But as his company grew, so did the space between us. He stopped coming home for dinner. Then he stopped coming home before midnight. Then sometimes he wouldn't come home at all, always business trips, emergencies, meetings that couldn't wait. His phone never left his hand, even at the table. And slowly, his eyes stopped meeting mine. I tried not to complain. I told myself this was temporary, that all great men had seasons of sacrifice, but those seasons turned into years. And with each passing day, I felt myself disappearing from his world. He'd sit across from me at breakfast, scrolling through emails, nodding absently while I talked. Our weekends, once sacred, were consumed by conference calls and investor meetings. Even our anniversaries became calendar conflicts. Still, I tried. I begged him to go to therapy with me, not because I thought we were broken, but because I wanted us to learn how to communicate before it was too late. He told me he didn't have time. I suggested date nights. He said they were too much planning. I asked for phone-free dinners. He said he needed to stay connected. I learned the hard way that you cannot fix a relationship alone. I tried to share his world, picked up running so I could join him in his early morning workouts. He stopped inviting me. I suggested we build something together, a hobby, a passion project, anything to bring us closer. He brushed it off as a waste of time. I even joined him at work events, standing by his side as he schmoozed investors and praised his team. But in those rooms, I was invisible, just another accessory to the man of the hour. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the condescension. Whenever I tried to talk about my feelings, about how isolated I felt, how much I missed him, he would sigh, roll his eyes, and tell me I was being dramatic. "Do you think any of this is easy?" he'd snap. "I'm doing all this for us, for our future." And I believed him, at least at first. But how do you build a future with someone who's already left you behind? It was like watching the man I loved dissolve in front of me. Every time I reached for him, I touched nothing but air. And yet, I clung harder, convinced that if I just loved him enough, tried hard enough, he would remember who we were. But even love has a breaking point. And somewhere deep inside me, I could feel something beginning to crack. I didn't leave right away. I did what people in love do when the ground starts slipping. I dug my heels in and tried to widen the ledge. I enrolled us, in my head, in a rescue plan that had 1,000 small steps and one loud hope. If he couldn't come closer, I would find a way to reach him where he stood. I started by speaking his language, systems, and routines. I proposed phone-free dinners twice a week, short and precise, 30 minutes, calendar invites sent in advance with a topic line that said nothing more than us. He declined half, postponed most, and when he did sit across from me, he kept glancing at the phone he'd turned face down like a dog told to stay. I asked for Sunday mornings without email. He said investors didn't honor weekends. I asked for one evening walk a week. He said the market opens in Asia at night. Every request bounced off a schedule that felt like a god he worshipped, and I merely inconvenienced. So I turned to therapy, first alone, then together. I told him I wasn't assigning blame. I wanted tools. He said tools were for people who couldn't think. He agreed to one couple's session, arrived 20 minutes late, sat with his arms folded, and told the counselor that planning leisure exhausted him because it introduced another variable to manage. When the counselor asked what he did to feel close to me, he talked about spreadsheets, budgets, and the architecture of our future. When she asked what I needed, I said out loud, for the first time in months, that I needed kindness without effort attached. He looked genuinely confused, as if kindness were a line item you checked off once the quarterly numbers cleared. I tried meeting him on his turf, sports, motion, sweat he could respect. I laced up at 5 a.m. to run beside him. He took off at his pace and shouted tips over his shoulder, more coach than partner, and when I caught up, he critiqued my form like a manager reviewing a slide deck. I asked to learn the sport he loved most. He suggested times that only worked if I skipped bedtime with our child, then raised an eyebrow when I said I couldn't. On the rare evening he offered to teach me, the lesson slid into condescension. How to hold, how to swing, how to breathe, all delivered with the patience of a man who believed patience itself was a favor. I proposed small projects we could build together, raised beds on the patio, a bookshelf for the playroom, even a silly idea for a weekend pop-up selling the bread I'd taught myself to bake. He said yes in principle, then disappeared when it came time to lift lumber or knead dough. He would pass by, drop a comment about efficiency, and vanish into a call. I finished alone, proud and tired in the same breath, and showed the results like a child hopping for praise. He nodded and said it looked fine. I planned dates. I made them easy. A new taco place that didn't take reservations and sat us at the bar. A local gallery with late hours, tickets already on my phone. A movie whose runtime he'd approved. He canceled, rescheduled, then canceled again, and told me he felt pressured by the very existence of plans. On Saturdays, he suggested I go see my family so he could catch up. On Sundays, he wanted me to take our child to the park so he could get ahead. It became a joke I told myself in the grocery line. Forward, back, never here. The phone was the third person at our table. Morning, noon, and night, it occupied the space where his attention might have lived. I asked for zones, no phone at breakfast, no phone in bed. He called it unrealistic. I said I wanted to feel important enough to warrant eye contact. He said he heard me fine with his eyes on the screen. I stopped asking and started nodding. Which is to say, I learned the difference between making a request and documenting a pattern. I kept doing the inner work because it was the only part I could control. Therapy gave me new words for old wounds and a steadier voice. I learned to name condescension without raising mine, to state needs without apologizing for them in advance, to hold silence when he filled it with work so I wouldn't be tempted to fill it with excuses. I learned that boundaries are not walls. They're doors you choose to open and close. When he said we should do things he liked, I tried. I learned his sport, just not with him. I joined a beginners group that celebrated effort, not output, and found joy where he found only metrics. I joined a women's running club and discovered that being slow in company can feel like being held. I went to a climbing gym on a whim and learned that fear can be coaxed into focus if you breathe through your hands. He rolled his eyes when I told him and called those clubs a waste of time. I went anyway. When he asked on a Tuesday whether I'd be home that night because he might be free, I told him I had plans. He didn't like that my life had started to shape itself without asking his calendar for permission. I stopped begging him to join the small rituals that make a family feel like a family. Pancakes on Sundays, bedtime stories, the dance party that lives in the 15 minutes between bath and pajamas. I invited him, I didn't plead. When he chose work, we danced without him. The first time I ate dinner alone by choice, it felt like defeat. The fifth time, it felt like peace. I set a plate for myself that didn't look like an apology, roasted vegetables, a piece of fish, a glass of wine I didn't gulp. I ate at the table, not over the sink. I stopped performing loneliness and called it solitude. His jealousy arrived sideways. Not because I was flirting or rushing toward anyone else, but because I stopped orbiting him. Instead of asking to join me, he critiqued my choices. He said the women I met were shallow, that the fitness groups were frivolous, that the hours I spent on myself were hours stolen from the family. He proposed late-night workouts after our child was asleep. I told him my body did not belong to a schedule that only acknowledged me when the day had used me up. He told me I was being inflexible. I told him I was being a person. He took trips without me, international ones that stretched into months under the flag of expansion and strategy. I stopped waiting at the gate in my head. When he called from hotel lobbies and told me about rooms full of men who clapped at the right times, I listened, said I was proud, and hung up gently instead of lingering for crumbs. When he came home jet-lagged and brittle, I offered calm instead of effusiveness. He mistook that for indifference. It was arithmetic. I couldn't keep financing our life with interest I never earned back. Couples counseling made one last appearance. He arrived on time, arms unfolded, and said all the correct words like he was reading from a manual. For 2 days afterwards, he was unusually present, moved his phone to a different room at dinner, asked me 2 genuine questions, and kissed me at the sink without glancing over my shoulder. On day 3, the phone crept back, the questions receded, and the kiss landed on my cheek like a distracted signature. I didn't punish him for failing to keep the high. I just stopped pretending the spike was the trend. By then, the emotional exit had already begun. You don't pack a suitcase for that. You simply stop unpacking his absences. I started making plans without consulting a calendar that didn't consult me. I took our child to the beach for a full day when his nastiness spilled into breakfast. We built a crooked sandcastle and ate sandy strawberries and came home sun-tired and happy. He called twice, then texted that dinner would be late. I wrote back a thumbs up and meant we already ate. It felt disloyal at first, to enjoy anything he didn't curate, to laugh without wanting to bottle the sound for when he had time. But joy, once it remembers your name, is greedy. It keeps showing up, asking only that you notice. I noticed. In noticing, the tether loosened. Somewhere in that season, a colder clarity arrived. Not revenge, not even a plan yet. Just the understanding that love is not enough to carry a person who refuses to walk. I began to keep better records, not of his failures, but of my own endurance. Dates, promises, outcomes. Not because I wanted to win an argument, but because I needed to stop gaslighting myself about how hard I'd tried. I also began, quietly, to understand the contours of his other world, not the glamour on stage, but the scaffolding behind it. Public filings, press releases, the way a company phrases a loss to sound like a pivot. I didn't go looking for dirt. I went looking for context. I wanted to know what exactly I had been competing with all these years. The answer wasn't a mistress or a vice. It was a machine that ate hours and spit out applause. He fed it pieces of himself and called it legacy. He fed it pieces of us and called it necessary. By the time the first real crack ran the length of my patience, I was no longer trying to keep the roof from leaking with cups. I was standing in the doorway, watching the weather, and wondering if staying inside counted as survival or surrender. That was the thing no one tells you about leaving. Before you pack a box, you leave in 1,000 tiny ways. You eat alone. You stop narrating your day to someone who isn't listening. You stop asking a phone to put you back together. You accept an invitation you would have declined out of loyalty. You turn down the volume on the life you were promised and raise it on the life you are actually living. And one afternoon, doing nothing dramatic at all, folding laundry, deleting old screenshots, tossing a dead houseplant, you realize you've already put your heart somewhere safer. I hadn't walked out. Not yet. But I had stopped standing in place. There isn't a single day you can circle and say, that's when I left. There's only the slow subtraction of hope until what remains is a clean, almost sterile certainty. I woke into that certainty one Tuesday, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing had. He left before dawn with his suitcase standing at attention near the door, sent a kiss into the air that landed nowhere, and promised to call from the car. I poured cereal for our child, shut off the news when the anchor started speaking in emergencies, and realized I hadn't planned dinner despite years of muscle memory. I wasn't forgetting. I had stopped scheduling my life around a man who treated time like a currency only he was allowed to spend. The house responded to my new pace as if it had been waiting. I rearranged the living room, not as a declaration, but because the sofa wanted to face the window. I cleared a corner of the kitchen for my notebooks and recipes. The counter stopped pretending it was a landing strip for his phone. I started sleeping on my side of the bed instead of sleeping around the space he sometimes occupied. The sheets stopped smelling like compromise. I learned to mother without narrating it for an audience of one. Bedtimes no longer auditioned for a father who might arrive. They belonged to the two of us. We built forts from cushions and negotiated treaties with stuffed animals and grew basil in a plastic pot that looked optimistic on the sill. When a fever came, I handled it without texting play-by-plays to a man in a hotel robe. When a good day came, I saved the joy for the person who had earned it. The child who had learned to whistle, the woman who had learned to make stock from bones and patience. Outside the house, I practiced belonging to places that weren't attached to his name. The running club turned into friendships sealed by sweat and jokes about pace. The climbing gym taught me a vocabulary of small victories, a new route, a cleaner foot, a fear that backed down. On Saturday mornings, I drove to a farmer's market and learned 3 farmers' names. They learned mine and the names of the greens I preferred. I invited neighbors for coffee and cake and watched conversations bloom like something we'd forgotten could grow in this climate. My circle wasn't large, but it was alive. He noticed at odd angles. He'd come home at 11, drop a suitcase in the foyer, and find a calendar pinned to the corkboard that had entries not marked maybe or if you don't need me. He'd comment on how often I was out, as if I were violating curfew. I explained without heat that a life requires oxygen. He reminded me, with the faint impatience of a man who believes he is stating the obvious, that all of this, house, clubs, time, existed because he worked. I didn't argue the arithmetic. I simply refused to balance the ledger with my absence. He also noticed the phone-free zones I kept without asking. I ate with our child at a table where a device was not a third chair. He joined once or twice, then stood to take a call within minutes, mouthing sorry with a thumb raised to heaven. I didn't perform the usual forgiveness. I noted the empty chair and finished the story about the dragon with a child who no longer looked toward the doorway when a sound announced his father's return. It turned out even small people understand consistency. It turned out I did too. At work events, I stopped playing the accessory who smiled on cue. I stood with women who founded things without needing any man's biography to be impressive. I listened to stories about venture rounds and near misses and the unromantic work of payroll. I realized that my husband's company had trained him to narrate everything as conquest, while the women I admired narrated their work as stewardship. One story chases applause, the other builds something worth clapping for. I went home early from those events and slept well without waiting for a key in the door. The last time we sat in couples therapy, we did not stage a performance. He told the counselor he felt me pulling away, as if my distance were a weather pattern that arrived without cause. I said I had stopped sprinting toward a man who wouldn't turn around. The counselor asked what intimacy looked like to each of us. He described proximity to his success. I described a kindness that shows up in the room. The counselor marked our mismatch without choosing sides. We left holding a printout of communication strategies like a ceasefire written in neutral ink. He put it on the console table near his keys and never touched it again. Eventually, something inside me crossed a threshold so quietly I almost missed it. I stopped using the future as a bribe to survive the present. No more after this quarter, no more when things settle down, no more once this expansion lands. I lived in the now that existed, not the one I'd been promised. It was smaller and kinder, and to my surprise enough. This is the part where people expect a betrayal to justify an exit. A message found, a perfume that doesn't belong, a careless lie that cracks the whole facade. I found none of that. What I found was absence so profound it qualified as its own kind of infidelity. He hadn't cheated with a person. He had cheated with a machine and the identity it fed him. The result was the same. A woman alone in a marriage with a man who kept marrying his job. My lawyer entered the story then, not with threats but with clarity. I spoke to her first in hypotheticals. She answered in facts. We could separate finances in ways that didn't punish our child. We could document patterns of neglect without assigning cruelty he hadn't committed. We could draw a perimeter that honored my contributions to a life built from 2 people's early courage. She did not push me toward a door. She showed me where the hinges were. I went home lighter for knowing the exit wasn't a cliff. In parallel, I did the thing I had avoided for years. I opened the box of his work, not the press release version, but the paperwork that undergirded the image. I had access, not because I had snooped, but because for a long time he had trusted me to sign documents neither of us truly read. I read them now, not to weaponize them, to understand them. The company was not a single tower. It was a scaffolding strapped to a weather-vulnerable cliff. Some of the ties were strong. Some were merely decorative. There were internal memos about risk presented as language, not danger. There were compliance trainings signed with a flourish and ignored in practice. There were acquisitions built on culture fits that looked, to anyone awake, like aspirational fictions. I kept notes the way scientists keep notebooks, dated, specific, unemotional. I did not cross legal lines. I did not exfiltrate. I did not act. I learned. Later, people would decide I had been plotting all along. The truth was simpler and more damning. I had been forced by neglect to become fluent in a world my husband had used to excuse neglect. The teacher shows up when the student is ready. In my case, the subject was consequence. The invitation to revenge arrived as a whisper I ignored. Burn it down, make him feel it, teach him the cost of building a palace with no doors. I wasn't ready, not because I was too kind, but because I still believed there must be a version of us that could be salvaged if he would only look at me and say the quiet sentence, "You matter more than my calendar." He never said it. He said variations with nicer adjectives and expensive wine, but the subject and object remained unchanged. Work first. We are grateful beneficiaries. He didn't say it as an edict. He said it as a weather report. Clear skies for me, storms for you, bring an umbrella, don't make a fuss. Then came the week that braided all the threads into a rope I couldn't ignore. He returned from a month-long trip and announced, without malice, almost with pride, that he had been offered a seat on a panel that would require 5 more transatlantic flights before summer. Our child brought him a drawing of the 3 of us holding hands. He set it on the console table with the therapy printout and said we'd frame it later. He checked his phone, frowned at a number, and told me he might have to skip the kindergarten recital because an investor had a narrow window. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I didn't perform anguish for a man who understood only presentations. I said, in a voice that felt like it came from a very old place inside me, that this was the last time I would be surprised by his priorities. I told him I would no longer be reworking the weekend to fit the shape of his absences. I said I would be at the recital whether or not he came, and that a child's memory does not file these things under necessary business exception. He reached for the old line about the future we were building. I said the future had arrived and found this house empty. That night, after lights out and dishes, I sat at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic of mercy. I counted years of pleas against months of change. I weighed the love that remained against the respect that had eroded. I measured the risks of detonating a life against the risks of living one I was no longer in. The numbers refused to lie for me. The sum was not cruel. It was simply final. I slept, not like a woman who had made a plan, but like a woman who had stopped postponing the truth. In the morning, the sun did what it always does. It came up, indifferent and generous. I packed a snack for the recital and a folder for a meeting I had scheduled with a person who had once been my husband's ally and might, by necessity, become mine. I kissed my child's forehead and told them a true thing, that today would be a good day because we were going to sing. When the curtain rose that afternoon, 100 small voices found the note. I sang along under my breath, not because I needed the song, but because the song needed witnesses. There was an empty seat beside me. I did not save it with my sorrow. I saved it with my certainty. By the time we walked home hand in hand under a sky that couldn't decide between sun and rain, the quiet exit wasn't quiet anymore. It had a shape, a speed, a destination that wasn't punitive so much as precise. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to act. Once certainty took root, the plan didn't arrive as a cinematic montage. It came as a series of decisions arranged in the order they needed to be made. I wasn't trying to humiliate him. I wasn't trying to win. I was done living in a house where I had to audition for attention and raise a child in the draft of a man's performance. Whatever happened next had to be clean, lawful, and final. The first decision was logistical, disentangle quietly. I opened an account in my own name, redirected the small streams that had always flowed through me to the places they actually belonged. Groceries, childcare, heat, a life that runs on ordinary courage. I cataloged household assets, not as trophies, but as provisions for a crossing. I kept receipts like a pilgrim keeps water. I told no one who would feel obliged to warn him. I told only the people whose job is to safeguard thresholds. My lawyer, my therapist, the friend who could pick up our child without asking questions if the sky fell. The second decision was ethical. If I was going to act on what I knew about his company, it would not be as a scorned spouse with a grudge. It would be as a person who understands that power without boundaries becomes harm. I had read the policies they asked employees to sign. I had sat through the compliance videos that said retaliation poisons cultures and that certain risks are not optics, but obligations. I had watched him ignore those obligations when the cost was inconvenience. I had also watched the people 2 layers beneath him, smart, tired, hopeful, carry the weight of those choices. So I documented, not for spectacle, but for chain of custody. Dates, memos, slide decks that said one thing elegantly and another thing honestly in the notes. Certifications signed during flights because someone had attached them to a calendar invite labeled mandatory. I did not hack, guess, or embellish. I gathered the pieces that already lived in drawers and inboxes with my name on them, the way a careful person gathers loose nails from a floor before someone steps on them. The third decision was tactical, where to take the nails so no one pretended they were confetti, not to gossip channels, not to enemies who would turn a human problem into a headline, to the places built for this, the company's independent directors who actually behave like independent directors, the audit committee chair whose reputation is a currency he won't spend on a lie, the general counsel who would rather lose a contract than lose her license. And where the law required, the regulator whose job it is to measure whether everybody does it is a defense or a confession. I made the appointments without drama. A message to the chair's assistant asking for a brief, confidential meeting regarding compliance concerns. A note to legal marked privileged and confidential requesting the formal channel for reporting. The responses were prompt, polite, and quietly alarmed. People who recognize that when a spouse requests a room, you find a room. The day I walked into the building that had swallowed my husband whole, the marble looked like it had been polished by promises. I wore a simple dress and the calm that comes from sleeping on the right side of a decision. The receptionist asked whom I was there to see. I gave names that opened doors. I took the elevator with people who smelled like slide decks and jet fuel and thought, not unkindly, that I had been invisible here by design. I was a story they told themselves about stability. Today, I was a boundary. In a conference room that could have doubled as a chapel, I set the folder on the table and explained what it contained and what it didn't. I said I wasn't there to scorch earth or negotiate a private windfall. I said I wanted two things: for the company to honor its own rules, and for the people who keep it alive to stop paying the price for decisions made in rooms like this. I named patterns. Not peccadillos, internal controls treated as hurdles, not guardrails, disclosures massaged past the point of meaning, processes designed to satisfy audits rather than prevent harm. I described a culture where later means never when it inconveniences someone with a title. I did not ask them to take my word. I asked them to follow theirs. The audit chair listened the way you listen to a fire in the next room. General counsel asked clear, non-invasive questions, not to catch me, but to ensure she understood exactly which wires were frayed. The independent director thanked me without congratulating me. They took the folder and with it responsibility. We established a channel for follow-up that did not run through my husband. When I stood, their faces held a mix I recognized. Gratitude shaded with dread. Good. Dread means you're awake. It would be pretty to say I walked out into sunlight and felt free. What I felt was heavy and correct. There is a cost to telling the truth in systems designed to deny it. I paid part of it in advance by not looking back. What followed didn't explode. It unfolded. Internally first, discreet interviews, forensic reviews that left fingerprints only on the right hands, swirls of calendar holds with titles that said nothing and meant everything. Externally, the smallest ripple. A regulator's quiet inquiry, then a deepening one. A board statement that sounded like a promise to take things seriously because, for once, it was. The company's comms team drafted phrases with hinges, committed to transparency, enhancing controls, cooperating fully. The market yawned. That wouldn't last. At home, the life I had built on the other side of him kept its vows. School drop-offs that felt like rituals, not errands. Runs that stitched mornings together. Dinners at a table that noticed when I laid a place for myself with care. The phone did not sit between me and my child. We could hear our forks. He noticed the storm as a forecast, then as weather, then as a leak directly over his desk. He came home early 2 nights in a row and circled the subject like a man inspecting a fence for weaknesses. He mentioned regulators the way soldiers mention cold. He said the board was nervous, then overly cautious, then gold-plating the response. He mocked the phrase tone at the top with a laugh that sounded too loud for a quiet room. He didn't ask me anything. He didn't need to. He suspected enough to know that asking would make it real. I didn't volunteer. Not out of cruelty, but because this was no longer a conversation between spouses. It was a conversation between a company and its obligations. The board called an emergency session. His calendar went from armored to perforated. He sent fewer late-night emails that said big day tomorrow and more morning texts that said running late. I stopped counting. Then came the meeting I had expected from the moment I set the folder down. The one where stories meet consequences. He left in a suit that had seen applause and returned in a silence that had never lived in our house. He set his phone on the counter without looking at it, leaned his palms on the marble like a man who has finally felt its chill, and said, in a voice that had nothing left to sell, that he had been asked to step aside, pending the outcome. I said that sounded prudent. He stared at me as if I'd started speaking a language he used to know. He asked if I had anything to tell him. I said I had told the right people what they needed to know. He swallowed something that had his name on it. The press found a phrase to fit their need for drama: embattled executive, governance questions, culture under scrutiny. Investors asked for meetings with the board rather than selfies with the CEO. The company's stock did not crater. It sagged like a roof under old snow. The employees did what employees always do. They kept working while the weather changed above their heads. I sent a note to one mid-level manager I barely knew, saying simply that I hoped the process was treating her fairly. She wrote back that fairness in times like these felt like oxygen, rare and necessary. He pivoted to remorse with the skill of a man who has built a life on pivoting. He told me, finally, that he understood. He said he had been wrong to make the phone a god and the company a spouse. He said he could fix it, not the regulators, him. He said he wanted to prioritize us. He used the words I had begged for years to hear, and they landed like coins on a table after the bill has been paid by someone else. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't offer the easy absolution he'd trained himself to expect from applause. I said what was true, that I didn't want to be chosen out of fear, that I didn't want to be prioritized because the market had reminded him of his mortality, that I had spent years asking for less glory and more grace, and that grace isn't the prize you hand a woman when the audience leaves. I said the part that hurt to hear and soothed to say, that I had already left, and that leaving a house you still live in is the quietest, hardest work I have ever done. He asked if there was anything he could do to change my mind. I told him there were many things he could do to change himself. None of them would reset my clock. He cried once in the kitchen, not the elegant tear of a man in a movie, but the ugly sound of someone who has just realized the terms and conditions of consequence. I didn't comfort him. Comfort is a form of consent when the harm is ongoing. I made tea and left the room. The company did what companies must when the facts are facts, and the board would like to live in the good graces of a regulator. It accepted his resignation with a paragraph of thanks that read like a eulogy for a tenure that had outrun its ethics. The interim leader sent an all-hands that sounded like oxygen. The regulators kept asking for documents and got them. The market, having feigned indifference, exhaled relief at adult supervision. My lawyer and I moved the personal process from intention to paper. We filed, not with glee, but with competence. Custody that respected our child's need for steadiness. Finances that accounted for the years I spent keeping someone else's machine oiled with invisible labor. A division of property that refused both pettiness and martyrdom. He signed where a man signs when he has learned that bargaining is not the same as repair. In the last meeting with our mediator, he asked if there was a version of us that survived as friends. I told him there was a version of him that could become a good man in public and private. Whether that man would be my friend wasn't a question for today. He said he would wait. I said he would live. When the decree arrived, it was thinner than the life it ended. Paper always is. I put it in a drawer with our child's birth certificate and the recipe cards that smell like vanilla and something I can't name. I stood in the middle of the kitchen and said out loud the sentence that had carried me, that I had not burned anything down. I had simply stopped holding up a roof that someone else insisted was weatherproof while standing under a different sky. He texted the next morning from a rented apartment with a view that tried too hard. He said the silence was loud. I didn't respond. I made pancakes shaped like animals and poured syrup that remembered summer. I laced my shoes for a run with women who celebrate ordinary victories. I answered a message from the manager at his old company. Thank you for doing the hard thing the right way. I closed my eyes and let the gratitude wash over the part of me that had wondered, in the dark, if all of this had been a story I told to justify a leaving. That night, after our child fell asleep with a book on their chest, I sat at the table we had bought together and opened a notebook that belonged only to me. I wrote 3 lines. I asked for kindness and built my own when it didn't arrive. I asked for time and learned to honor mine. I asked for a partner and refused to become a prop. The plan hadn't been about punishment. It had been about proportion. He built an altar to work and asked us to pray. I declined. He mistook my decline for defiance and learned it was dignity. The company learned its governance was not a suggestion. The house learned it could be quiet without being empty. And I learned, finally, that leaving isn't the opposite of love. Sometimes, it is how you love the parts of yourself that a long neglect taught you to ignore. I went to bed in a room that didn't have to wait for a key. The sheets smelled like clean cotton and rain from a window I'd left open on purpose. Somewhere across town, a man who used to be my husband stared at a ceiling he had never noticed before. I didn't wish him pain. I wished him awareness. The first hurts like surgery. The second heals like sunlight. Morning would come as it always does, indifferent, generous. I slept. He moved out on a Tuesday because Tuesdays feel neutral, like the world won't notice if a home rearranges itself. The movers carried boxes past our child's watercolor sky taped to the hallway wall. He paused in front of it, as if the sun might offer him a reprieve, then signed the inventory list like a man countersigning his own absence. I made sandwiches in the kitchen, not as a performance of fortitude, but because people still need lunch on the day a life changes shape. He tried, in the way men who have always been rewarded for velocity try, by doing a lot quickly. He sent long emails to no one in particular about personal resets and the books he was reading. He scheduled quality time blocks into his shared calendar, invited me to dinners I did not attend, offered to fix things around the house that no longer required his hands. He texted pictures from parks on his custody days, our child's grin wide and sticky with popsicle, and wrote captions that sounded like captions. I clicked the hearts anyway. Some graces remain even when the sentiment doesn't. Neighbors asked carefully calibrated questions on sidewalks and in doorways. I answered with enough truth to honor their kindness and enough boundaries to honor mine. We're separating. We're co-parenting. We're okay. I didn't add that okay is an average of peaks and hollows, that some nights I slept like a girl in a tent and others like a cathedral with the doors thrown open to wind. I didn't add that the quiet in the house had changed frequencies. It no longer threatened. It hummed. At his company, the interim CEO sent memos that sounded like water over stone. Steady, patient, shaping. Systems hardened where they had been soft. Meetings ended with actions, not applause. An internal listening tour revealed what anyone who bothered to listen could have told them years ago, that people are not widgets and governance is not flavor. The board hired an independent firm to evaluate culture without euphemisms. The report did not name him as a villain. It named the habits that made his style inevitable. The remedy would be dull and virtuous. Better controls, clearer lines, leaders evaluated on how their teams fare, not just what their decks promise. The stock, bored by scandal and soothed by competence, flattened into something investors call predictable and humans call breathable. He found humility slowly and unevenly. In the early weeks, he swung between contrition and campaign, posting about lessons learned with a ring-light sincerity, then sending me midnight texts with bullet points about reunification, as if you could build a marriage with OKRs. I let the messages sit in their blue unreadness until morning, then answered only the ones about our child's dentist appointment or soccer kit. He called once, voice cracking across the line, and said the apartment felt like a hotel no one had booked. I reminded him gently that he had stayed in plenty of those. He laughed once, the old laugh, caught himself, and said thank you for not hatting him. I told him I didn't. Hatred is a tether. I had set mine down. People waited for drama that never arrived. There was no tell-all, no screaming in driveways, no rushed entanglements to prove either of us was still desirable. My revenge, if you insist on the word, was a life that did not seek vengeance. I ran with my friends, logged my miles, taught a neighbor's daughter to bake a cake that rose on the first try, and taught her to be gracious when it didn't. I started consulting for 2 small founders who had more ethics than capital, and watched them choose the boring right over the exciting risk. It felt like putting clean bricks where a wall had cracked. He asked, once, if we could meet. No agenda, just coffee on neutral ground. I chose a cafe with a patio because the sky makes certain conversations kinder. He looked smaller without a logo behind him. We talked logistics for 10 minutes because logistics are safer than regret. Then he asked if I ever thought we'd find our way back. I told him the truth that didn't try to wound, that I thought he might find his way forward, and that forward and back are not the same road. He nodded like a man who had finally stopped negotiating with a mountain. He said he was going to see a therapist twice a week, and that he had started leaving his phone in a drawer during meals. I said I was glad for the people who would benefit from those changes. He took the blessing without asking for more. News trickled in from the company like weather reports. The regulator closed its inquiry with a consent order that read like homework you do because you've learned why it matters, not because you're afraid of detention. The board published a governance update in prose so clear it felt radical. Employees told one another in hushed relief that meetings now ended 5 minutes early, and no one was expected to reply to emails sent after 10 p.m. He sent me a link to the update with a single line. "You were right." I didn't reply. Being right isn't the prize. Peace is. On our child's 7th birthday, he and I stood 3 feet apart behind a cake shaped like a dinosaur and sang the same song to the same small person with the same unembarrassed love. Our eyes met over the candles the exact length of a breath. It was not a reconciliation. It was a truce between two people who had remembered the one thing they still did well together: show up when it counts, even if we no longer count on each other. I built new rituals that did not require anyone else's consent. Friday nights became movie nights on a blanket in the living room, the kind where popcorn ends up everywhere and no one apologizes for joy. Sunday mornings turned into long walks, farmers market peaches eaten over a sink, juice down to the wrists. On Tuesdays, I kept a standing date with myself at a small museum that never felt crowded, the kind of place where a single painting can hold your whole week without getting tired. I stopped waiting for anniversaries to feel grateful. I made gratitude a chore I liked. Fold laundry, water plants, thank your own perseverance. His attempts at reclamation softened into practice. He missed fewer recitals and none he had promised to attend. He learned to sit on a sideline without refreshing an inbox. He taught our child to tie shoes in a way that did not become a lesson in efficiency. He apologized once without explaining why the apology had taken so long. He did not ask for forgiveness as a transaction. He behaved as if forgiveness might be a climate he could help sustain even if he never walked back into it. There were lonely nights. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Nights when the house sounded too big, when the future felt like a map without enough landmarks. On those nights, I did not text him. I texted the women who had run beside me in rain, who had seen me fail a route and try again, who had sat on my porch with tea cooling between us, while I figured out how to speak about a life in the past tense without making it a tragedy. They came with soup, with silence, with the kind of laughter that does not ask you to be cheerful first. We earned our belonging the old-fashioned way, by showing up. By the end of that first year apart, the life we had dismantled had stopped rattling in its box. Our child's drawings on my hallway wall now included 2 houses without storm clouds. The basil plant on the sill had learned to live in less sun. I could sit at my kitchen table and plan a week that did not begin with someone else's flight itinerary. He sent a photo once from a modest office in a modest building where he'd taken a role that paid in humility what it lacked in headlines. Starting over, the message said. I wrote back, "Good." People asked, every so often, if I'd do anything differently. I said I would have enforced phone-free dinners sooner, kissed my own forehead earlier, learned earlier the distinction between supporting a dream and subsidizing a disappearance. But mostly, I would not. The road we took taught me what the scenic routes never do. That endurance is not the same as devotion, that boundaries are not punishments but shapes of love, that leaving can be a form of staying, for yourself, for a child, for the part of you that refused to die quietly. The last time he tried to talk me into hope, it didn't sound like a pitch. We were at the park, the son making an argument for ice cream, our child arguing more successfully. He waited until the sprint for sprinkles carried the small person out of earshot and said simply that he missed being my home. I told him I believed him. I told him I hoped he would be someone else's safe place someday, built with the lumber of his lessons. I told him I was my own home now, and that our child had 2 roofs that no longer leaked. He nodded, swallowed, and smiled not at me, but at the person running back toward us with a cone melting down a wrist. He took a napkin from his pocket like a man who had learned, finally, which messes are his to clean. There are endings that arrive with fireworks and endings that arrive with paperwork. Ours arrived like a harbor, quiet, exact, full of ropes tied the right way. He would be fine. More importantly, he might be good. I already was. The life I'd folded myself into to make us fit had smoothed itself back out. I slept diagonally sometimes, greedy with space, and woke laughing at the luxury. The story could end there, on a bench, On a Tuesday, ice cream crisis averted, two adults practiced at tenderness that doesn't pretend to be romance. But there was one thing left to do, and I had known it since the day I put a folder on a boardroom table. I owed myself a final act that wasn't about him at all. I signed the lease on a small studio a 15-minute walk from our house. Not to hide, not to hoard, but to make. A place where flour could live in a jar without announcing dinner, where pages could live on a wall without apologizing for being unfinished, where music could be loud at odd hours and silence could be louder if I needed it to be. I painted one wall the color of a word I couldn't translate, somewhere between dawn and bravery. I put my grandmother's mixing bowl on a shelf like an heirloom and my running shoes by the door like a promise. When I unlocked that door for the first time with no groceries in my hands, I understood what all those tiny exits had been leading toward. Not emptiness, not even independence. Presence, in my own life, on my own terms, without a phone face down on the table like a third party waiting to cut in. If there was a final conversation, it would not be a confrontation. It would be a statement of fact delivered without heat, that I had ended the marriage without ending the family, that I had alerted a company to its own reflection without trying to break the mirror, that I had loved a man enough to let him learn without me. It was time to give that sentence its ceremony, but ceremonies don't require witnesses. They require intention. So I baked a cake in the studio oven that runs a little hot, wrote our child's name and mine in icing that wobbled, and lit 2 candles. I made a wish like a woman who no longer needs wishes to justify her work. Then I blew them out and opened the window so the smoke could find the street and go tell the city that a small, significant thing had happened upstairs. A life had chosen itself. Tomorrow I would text him about pickup time and sunscreen and a permission slip. Tomorrow he would respond within an hour instead of a day. Tomorrow our child would wake up in a house where love wasn't a performance and go to bed in another where love was learning to be quiet and real. Tonight, I washed the bowl and left it on the rack to dry. I turned off the lights and stood for a long moment in the dark, seeing everything I couldn't when the room was bright. Edges, outlines, the way a shape announces itself when you stop flooding it with glare. Then I locked the door and walked home. The first autumn on my own arrived like a truth that didn't need to be defended. The mornings cooled, the basil gave up with dignity. Our child learned a new song at school and sang it until the walls knew the chorus. I learned the roots in our neighborhood that turned exactly as the light did, the streets where the trees met over the road like a promise. Nothing spectacular happened. That was the spectacle. Work found its rightful size. The 2 founders I'd been advising survived their first near-death cash flow winter and sent me a photo the day their product finally shipped without apology. I hung it in the studio beside a watercolor done by a 7-year-old who insisted the sky could be orange if you believed hard enough. On Thursdays, I taught a tiny class in that same room, 3 women in sneakers and 1 retired nurse in sandals. How to bake bread that didn't require more than patience. We talked about hydration ratios, and also about marriages, and also about knees that ached, and also about grandchildren, and also about the price of peaches. Flour made the floor a little ghostly. We left our handprints on the counter and washed them away. Co-parenting settled into a rhythm that didn't require heroics. He showed up when he said he would, with snacks that didn't pretend to be a personality. He learned which stuffed animal carried the heaviest jurisdiction and honored it. He sent fewer texts that sounded like weather reports from the interior of his regret and more that read like ordinary competence. Sometimes he looked tired in a new way, the tired of a person who pays attention. It suited him. It didn't belong to me. He wrote a letter, months after the decree and weeks after I had stopped anticipating its arrival. It wasn't a petition or a pitch. It was a record. The names of the things he'd broken without understanding they were breakable, the dates he wished he could return to, the sentence he should have learned to say before a boardroom taught him harsher equivalents. He didn't ask for another chance. He asked me to know that he finally understood the difference between building and devouring. I read it once, carefully. I placed it in the drawer with the birth certificate and the recipe cards and the order that made our family official in its new shape. Some documents end things. Some preserve them. The company, now undisputedly not his, became a place people could work without borrowing a second nervous system. A woman from compliance who had once sat through his presentations sent me a thank you note with too many exclamation points, and a pressed leaf tucked inside. I didn't pin it anywhere. I carried it in my wallet for a month, then let the leaf go on the studio windowsill, where it curled into a small, perfect ear. There were invitations, to weekends away, to dinners where someone else cooked, to conversations that might have become flirtations if either of us had wanted them to. I discovered that I could be desired without being endangered. I discovered, more surprisingly, that I could decline kindly without fear of scarcity. Love was not a race I had to re-enter to prove I wasn't broken. I was not broken. I was busy, in the way that means full. On a winter afternoon too bright to be called sad, our child asked directly whether we would ever live together again. I did not outsource the answer to euphemism. I said that 2 happy homes are better than 1 uncertain one, that grown-ups sometimes love each other best from a respectful distance, that nothing about our love for them was negotiable. They thought for a moment, really thought, and then proposed we all still have pancake Saturdays, just on different Saturdays. We adopted the policy immediately. Governance can be humane when the board is honest. I went back once to the old building. Not inside, past it, on the way to meet someone for coffee at a place that hadn't existed when I used to haunt the lobby. The marble still shone, the revolving door still performed its small, dizzying trick. I did not feel triumphant or small. I felt even. A place where I used to look up, measured now against a self that stood at her own height. I texted him nothing. I kept walking. Spring asked less of me than winter had and gave more. The basil came back without a speech. The running route that used to defeat me turned ordinary, then easy, then mine. The studio smelled like lemon peels and new paper. I said yes to a weekend away with friends and slept in a room with windows that opened onto a lake that didn't care who I had been married to. I learned to paddle a canoe badly and loved it anyway. I sent a postcard to my own mailbox that said, "You did a hard thing and the world kept being beautiful." He stumbled, as people do who are trying to live in a new key. He missed a pickup once by 20 minutes and arrived carrying too many apologies in a grocery store bouquet. I accepted the flowers on behalf of a kitchen that would enjoy them and enforce the boundary on behalf of a child who counts minutes. He nodded, not performatively, and bought a watch that wasn't a phone. That is how behavior changes. Unglamorous, specific, repeated. Sometimes, late, the mind plays its old tricks. It brings back a montage of beginnings, edits them to remove all foreshadowing, and asks if you miss the myth. I let it play through. I thank it for the artistry. Then I return to the texture of the present, the weight of a book in my hands, the sound of a child calling from the hallway with a question about whales, the scrape of a chair across a studio floor, the quiet at a dinner table that feels like rest, not reprieve. On the anniversary we no longer observed, I kept the day like an ordinary one on purpose. I ran, I worked, I answered emails, I replaced a light bulb, I laughed at a meme sent by a woman who once pulled me over a crux with 2 fingers and a command. After bedtime, I walked to the studio with a thermos of tea and the certainty that no one waited to interrupt me. I put on a record my grandmother would have called noise and my child would have called cool. I danced, badly, alone. Grief and gratitude took turns holding my hand, not fighting for custody, just taking their turns like decent partners at a kitchen party. If this is the moral, let it be small enough to fit in a pocket. Love is not measured by how long you hold on to what is hurting you. Work is not a spouse. Phones are not altars. Boundaries are not punishments, they are the shape of your yes. Spreadsheets don't raise children, presence does. And leaving, when you must, is sometimes the first honest thing you do for everyone involved. The last line belongs, as it should, to a child. On a day I thought was unremarkable, we were walking home from school through air that smelled faintly of cut grass and rain. They reached up, put their sticky hand in mine, and said that our house feels softer now. I asked what that meant. They said the rooms don't try so hard. I understood. I squeezed once and promised to keep it that way. At home, I turned my phone face down not to make a point, but because there was nothing in it I needed more than the life in the room. The window was open. The curtains moved. Somewhere across town, a man who had been my husband stood at his own window, I imagine, and took a breath that didn't require an audience. We had become, at last, 2 people telling truer stories with the years we had left. I set the table for dinner, 2 plates, one small, one mine, and lit a candle for no reason except that I could. The flame leaned, then steadied. The day folded itself neatly. I ate, I listened, I laughed. And when the dishes were done and the floor swept and the backpack packed and the light turned out, I lay down in a bed that did not ask me to make a case for my worth. I slept like a person who had kept her promise, to herself, to a child, to a future that doesn't need a spotlight to be seen. En ache alodef oyer em yeru.